A group of nearly 100 different student representatives, organizations, and institutions have signed a letter to the U.S. Department of Justice asking that they block the proposed merger between the education publishers Cengage and McGraw-Hill. The letter was published on U.S. Public Independent Research Group's site on July 29th. For eLearning Inside, my name is Henry Kronk. This week on Ed Technically, I'm going to discuss this pushback that student groups and others have voiced against the proposed merger between Cengage and McGraw-Hill and consider what's at stake. So the letter asked the DOJ to block the deal on the grounds that it will violate antitrust law and limit competition in the market. They write, quote, "The merger threatens to consolidate more power in the grasp of a handful of publishers who have used their enormous market share to drive up prices for consumers over the course of the past few decades," end quote. These advocates argue that if successful, the newly formed McGraw-Hill would have the power to further drive up the cost of textbooks and college course materials without facing any competition that could bring these prices back down and undercut their deals. The authors cite textbook publishers' previous ability to incentivize students to purchase their offerings as a harbinger of what could arise. They write, quote, "By reducing the need to compete and then using access code subscription services and inclusive access to strong-arm students into buying materials, Cengage and McGraw-Hill will be able to continue their decades-long pattern of raising prices. Eventually, they will reach the goal of eliminating the used book market entirely and set themselves up as the sole provider of class materials. This kind of control of the market will not be in students' best interests." A separate, more detailed letter authored by the advocacy group Open Markets was also sent to the DOJ on Monday. The letter includes similar arguments as those voiced by U.S. PIRGs, but adds several new folds as well. So, one of these advocates of textbook publishers might say, what are you talking about? There's plenty of competition. There's the used market out there. But the DOJ doesn't necessarily see things that way, and Open Markets' letter calls attention to this. For example, they discuss the merger between Pearson and the education and professional publishing wing of Viacom in 1998. During that merger, the DOJ filed a complaint against the move. And while the complaint focused on sections of the market where the two compete directly, it added the following language. Quote, "Textbooks are generally revised every 3 to 4 years. And professors usually require the use of the newest edition. This limits the ability of used textbooks to compete with new texts. Supply of used textbooks is also limited by the number of students that sell their textbooks back to college bookstores. Used textbooks cannot defeat an increase in the price of new textbooks or a decrease in the supply of the ancillary materials included or sold with them," end quote. So, citing recent statements from the two companies, Open Market says that Cengage and McGraw-Hill control 20% and 21% of the U.S. textbook publishing market share, respectively. And the company Pearson, meanwhile, controls 41%. Under this measure, just two companies would control 82% of the textbook market after the proposed merger. That's Pearson and the newly formed McGraw-Hill. This statement, however, seems to contradict an earlier one in the letter which reads, quote, "Only 5 companies currently control 80% of the college textbook market. These are Pearson, Cengage McGraw-Hill, Macmillan, and Wiley," end quote. Calculating market share is always a subjective process. Still, it appears that the merger would very clearly breach the precedent set in United States v. Philadelphia National Bank, The case established a limit whereby any merger that brought about a new entity that controlled 30% of any market would be in violation of antitrust law. So, how does the student fit in here? Student PIRGs have been campaigning against the rise in textbook costs for over 10 years. The Open Markets letter describes how, since the 1970s, the cost of textbooks have risen at 3 times the rate of inflation. But student PIRG's research indicates that just in the past 10 years since they've been tracking the market, the cost has risen at 4 times that of inflation. This comes when college tuition and student debt are also at an all-time high. Numerous pieces of research have appeared recently describing the measures to which students resort when buying course material. Cengage sponsored one of these and found that 4 in 10 students skip meals to afford textbooks, among other measures. But other research adds a new twist in this narrative. The National Association of College Stores, NACS, tracks undergraduate spending habits. Their latest report surveyed over 20,000 students in the US and Canada, and it found that the average student spent $415 during the 2018-2019 school year on course materials related to the classes that they were taking. So that's a lot, but it marks a 41% decline since 2008, when the average student spent about $700. Still, course materials make up only a portion of this, and spending in that category has held steady since 2014. So these two phenomena, the rising cost of college textbooks and the steady/dropping spending on course materials, paints a pretty harsh narrative. It indicates that as college gets more expensive, students are turning more to cost-saving measures when buying or not buying course materials. Cengage and McGraw-Hill maintain the position that the market has changed and that they won't be able to neglect the student perspectives going forward. In a previous interview with eLearning Inside regarding the health of Cengage Unlimited, CEO Michael Hansen said, quote, "The times when students did not matter are over. I want to be really emphatic on that. This industry relied for too long on the notion that if I can convince the professor, I don't need to worry about the student and I can charge whatever I want. These times are over, and they're over for good. The market is so transparent now that the student can find alternatives at any given point. The real challenge for any provider in the market, frankly, doesn't matter if this is a publisher or a provider of tutoring services, is you've got to show value for money." End quote. So that's the pushback. Those are the main points. The next question is, what's going to happen? Nicole Allen is the Director of Open Education for the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition, or SPARC, and she compiled a Q&A post about the proposed merger. Allen speculates that, quote, "If history is any guide, the current regulatory environment tilts the playing field in the merger's favor. It is unlikely that the companies would have proposed the merger unless they had some preliminary conversations with DOJ and were reasonably confident that it would go through." End quote. There have been a few notable mergers in the textbook market in the past 20 years that attracted DOJ complaints. In the Pearson-Viacom merger mentioned above, the DOJ found that the two were among just 4 businesses competing directly in what they described as the basal elementary science publishing market. The names of their suite of offerings in this space could even be confused with one another. Viacom was making Discovery Works, and Pearson was coming out with Discover the Wonder. For their final judgment, therefore, the DOJ required Pearson to sell off one of these elementary science catalogs. Similarly, in 2008, Cengage moved to acquire Houghton Mifflin's higher education assets. Again, the DOJ identified areas in which the companies directly competed with one another. In this case, prosecutors singled out a list of 14 individual textbook titles and required Cengage to sell off their existing texts or those of Houghton Mifflin before the deal went through. So with the proposed complete merger of Cengage and McGraw-Hill, it seems likely that the DOJ might identify, well, let's say more than 14 individual titles in which they compete directly. Academic publishers like the two in question have since become companies that might be better described as edtech providers and developers instead of textbook publishers. And the areas in which they compete directly now might extend to digital platforms, testing, course supplements, and more. In that regard, much remains to be seen. This has been Ed Technically. My name is Henry Kronk, and I work as the editor of eLearning Inside. If you liked this episode, please rate and review. If you'd like to hear more, please subscribe. Also, keep in mind that this show is available as a video on YouTube and also as a podcast on Stitcher, iTunes, Spotify, and Google Play. The basic content for this video first appeared as an article on eLearning Inside, and if you would like to hear more about online courses, technology in the classroom, and EdTech in general, be sure to check out our site. If you'd like to get in touch with me, please send an email to henry@elearninginside.com. You can also follow us on Twitter @eLearninginside. Thanks for listening.